For many people, the Bible is nothing more than a collection of outdated laws, and its persistent use in our world does more harm than good. A book that supports slavery is not a book with any usefulness for us today. And that might be a reasonable claim to make if the Bible actually promoted slavery. A look to what the Bible actually says, however, reveals a different story. What does the Bible teach about slavery, and how do we make sense of God's actions with this institution today? This is Catholicism in Focus. On the surface, yes, the Bible appears to support the institution of slavery. There are laws to how to acquire and govern slaves, Jesus does not condemn it, and St. Paul, given the opportunity to speak against it, tells a runaway slave to return to his master. If all we did was read a summary of the Bible, we might be led to believe that God supported slavery. Luckily for us, we are much smarter than that and need not stop with surface-level analyses. We can find the texts themselves, we can read them within their context, and we can come to the very obvious conclusion that what the Bible allowed 2,500 years ago is very different from what we've seen in the modern era. When most people talk about slavery, they're thinking about chattel slavery, the forced servitude of human beings through kidnapping. In the African slave trade of the 17th and 18th centuries, human beings were treated as worthless property, subject to anything and everything the owner wanted of them. This is nothing like the slavery mentioned in the Bible. For one thing, the book of Exodus expressly forbids kidnapping for any reason. A kidnapper, whether he sells the person or the person is found in his possession, shall be put to death. Yeah, that sort of thing was not tolerated. Buying and selling slaves was permitted once someone was already a slave, but you couldn't just take a human being and sell them to another person as property. Rather, the vast majority of slaves in that time ended up that way not by force, but by choice. Owing a debt that could not be paid, people would sell themselves, particularly their labor, in placement of what was owed. An example of this can be seen at the end of the book of Genesis when famine strikes. Hungry and unable to pay for food, the Egyptians come to Joseph with only themselves to sell. "Why should we and our land perish before your very eyes? Take us and our land in exchange for food, and we will become Pharaoh's slaves and our land his property. Only give us seed that we may survive and not perish, and that our land may not turn into a waste." They weren't forced into servitude, but chose it themselves as a means of survival. There were, of course, some that became slaves as a result of war, but that still is quite different from simply kidnapping the weak and forcing them into servitude. Enemy combatants are always treated differently than civilians. That being said, even if someone became a slave due to war, this did not give the owner license to treat them however he chose, as seen in modern conceptions of slavery. Rather, even in servitude, slaves retained rights and dignity. Exodus 21 states, "When someone strikes his male or female slave in the eye and destroys the use of the eye, he shall let the slave go free in compensation for the eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let the slave go free in compensation for the tooth." You heard that right. If a slave is maimed or hurt, he or she was due their freedom. This is not how slaves were treated in the African slave trade. Furthermore, both Exodus and Deuteronomy explicitly state that slaves are to have rest on the Sabbath as well, making no distinction between Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves. They deserved rest like everyone else because, believe it or not, the Israelites acknowledged, even 2,500 years ago, that slaves are still human beings. More significant even than that, however, is the fact that slavery was not necessarily a lifetime sentence in biblical law. Not only were there ways to gain one's freedom, upon doing so, the owner had a responsibility to help them. If your kin, a Hebrew man or woman, sells himself or herself to you, he or she is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall release him or her as a free person. When you release a male from your service as a free person, you shall not send him away empty-handed, but shall weigh him down with gifts from your flock and threshing floor and winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, so you shall give to him. The case of foreign slaves was a bit different, as this option was not available to them, but that did not stop them from simply running away without fear of being tracked down. In the event that they found shelter in another's home, Deuteronomy states, You shall not hand over to their master any slaves who have taken refuge with you from their master. Again, this is nothing like modern slavery. African slaves were not released after 6 years, they could not run away with immunity, and they most certainly weren't given a parting gift. Modern slavery and biblical slavery are two very, very different institutions. And yet, that is not to say that this form of slavery is necessarily a good thing either. Claiming to be better than the African slave trade is a pretty low bar. Supporting even this institution is problematic. That is, if the Bible actually supported it. What's often overlooked in discussions like these is that there is a big difference between supporting something and merely tolerating it. While there are laws in the Old Testament stating how the practice is to be governed, this is a far cry from open support. Rather, like Moses' allowance of divorce or the law stipulating an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, what we see here is an example of moral pragmatism. It's not the will of God, not something that humanity should seek, but also not something our frail humanity was able to avoid at the time. Rather than futilely attempting to ban it, it was far more practical to focus attention on regulating it. You shouldn't get divorced, for marriage is a covenant, but if you must, do it in this humane way. You should not use violence to solve your problems, but since you're going to seek justice in that way, just don't go overboard. Let your retaliation be equal to the damage incurred, no more. And you shouldn't own another human being, but if they owe you a debt and wish to pay it off through servitude, be sure to treat them with respect and care. At no point in the Bible, in either testament, do we find evidence of God giving an endorsement of this behavior. The closest we might point to is St. Paul, an apostle, insisting that a runaway slave return to his master, but even in that situation, it's clear that he hopes for change. In his letter to the slave owner, he writes, "Perhaps this is why he was away from you for a while, that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a brother, beloved especially to me, but even more so to you, as a man and in the Lord." St. Paul didn't denounce the institution as a whole, but clearly wanted to reform it from within. It's for this reason that the far more logical conclusion, when taking the Bible as a whole, is that God found the institution of slavery repugnant. Overwhelmingly, God hears the cries of the poor and sides with the oppressed. The prophets, speaking for God, repeatedly denounce the abuse of the poor. I mean, really, God's greatest act of the Old Testament is the rescuing of his people from slavery to set them free. Even without an outright repudiation, despite the laws regulating it, when we look at the institution in practice, understanding how God acts in other situations, I think it's clear what to think. God would never support such an awful institution.